Hello, this is Alan Barton and welcome to Antiquarians Anonymous. In this video today I'm going to start a new series. It's a series on a topic that has always fascinated me since I was young, and that's medieval death. I'm going to talk about the practices surrounding the burial of the dead in medieval times. I'm going to talk about mummification and embalming. I'm going to talk about coffins and shrouds, burial vaults and tombs. I'm also going to look with you at evidence of memorialisation, about the different ways, methods and rituals medieval people had to remember their dead. This first video will be an exploration of an extraordinary discovery that was made in the 1850s. The body of an individual buried in a hole in the wall in one of medieval England's most iconic buildings, a building that no longer survives. The discovery of this body provides us with rich evidence of how the elite, the rich and the powerful of medieval England, prepared their bodies for burial. I do hope you enjoy the video. In January of 1852, a great army of builders were in the process of demolishing one of the great buildings of late medieval England, the medieval Palace of Westminster, which had been badly damaged after a fire in 1834. They were clearing away the remains of the medieval palace in order to build a new palace, what is commonly called today the Houses of Parliament. One of the most important structures within the medieval Palace of Westminster was the Chapel Royal, dedicated to St Stephen. It was a two-storey structure with an upper chapel and a lower chapel. During the 1834 fire, the upper chapel was entirely destroyed, but the lower chapel substantially remained, and in 1852 it was being repaired to serve as the chapel of the new Houses of Parliament. And while work was being undertaken to the walls of this lower chapel, a body was found in the cavity of a wall. Rather excited by the discovery of a body in the wall, Charles Barry, the architect who was overseeing the reconstruction of the palace, called in the Society of Antiquaries, and they sent a delegation of their members to examine the find. Photography was in its infancy at this time, so they brought with them G.F. Scharf, an experienced architectural draftsman, to make a record of the work. The delegation noted that the placement of the body was unusual. It had been placed in an excavated cavity in the rubble wall, and no attempt had been made, as was usual, to create a burial chamber or vault. The burial's location was just a few inches below the surface of the chapel floor and directly under a stone bench that ran around the inside of the chapel. The body's position in the building indicated that the person was important, for in medieval times, the more important you were, the closer you were buried to a church's altar, and this body was under the window in the north wall, directly adjacent to the site of the chapel's altar. This was not a spot that any old Tom, Dick and Harry would have been buried in a royal chapel. Laid across the body diagonally was a wooden crozier, the pastoral staff or crook used by a bishop, suggesting that the burial was probably that of a bishop with royal connections. Once the body had been removed from the wall, the fellows from the antiquaries came back again to further examine the body. The body before them looked for all the world like an Egyptian mummy. An attempt had been made to preserve the body from decay, and it had been wrapped up with great effort. Between 9 and 10 layers of cloth dipped in wax, called cerecloth, were used to wrap the corpse tightly, and this had solidified into a thick covering that had to be cut to gain access to the body within. The head and the legs of the body were individually wrapped, separately from the torso, and then the body was secured along its length with twine, knotted in various points with a half hitch. The upper arms were wrapped in with the torso, but the arms below the elbow were left free. The delegation from the Society of Antiquaries concluded that this was so the arms could be moved around and positioned to hold the bishop's crozier. The delegation took great care when unwrapping the head. When they pulled away the 10 outer layers of cerecloth, they discovered that the head had been wrapped in an initial layer of canvas that formed a kind of mask, and that this had also been tied onto the head with twine. When the canvas mask was removed, a perfectly preserved but blackened face was revealed. It was the face of a man in his late middle age. His mouth was stuffed with a plagiate of tow, a lint bandage that was saturated with wax, and this protruded from his mouth. Scharf took a plaster cast of the face, which is still in the possession of the Society of Antiquaries, and you can clearly see an indentation in the cheek where the plagiate of tow had been pressed into the side of the individual's face by the tight wrapping of the bandages. The precise purpose of this plagiate is unclear. It may have been thought to aid in the preservation process. Then the cerecloth was very carefully cut and pulled away to expose the body, with the hope of finding some grave goods that might help identify the man, but sadly there weren't any. The body was wrapped completely naked, and there were no clothes that might suggest his rank or his role in life. The antiquaries concluded that no solution had been applied to embalm the body, and the entrails and the organs of the man were still in place. The embalming process for the preservation of the body consisted entirely of this tight wrapping in waxed cloth. This had slowed down the decomposition of the corpse, with some parts, such as the head, drying out and desiccating, and the fleshier parts of the corpse turning into what's called adipocere, or grave wax. As I will show in later videos, attempts to mummify and preserve the bodies of the dead in medieval England and in France were not actually all that unusual, particularly for members of the royal family, whose bodies would have been laid in state for months on end before they were finally buried. The process would have been a costly one, and as well as the burial location, the treatment of this body indicates that the man in the wall was important and wealthy. So who was this man in the wall, and when did he die? Well, the bishop's pastoral staff, which is now in the British Museum, gives us a clue. The head of the staff is made of carved oak and the shaft of deal, of pine. There's no evidence that it was painted or gilded, and the use of such cheap materials suggests that it was made specifically for the purpose, for the burial of a dead bishop. The style of the pastoral staff suggests it dates from the 15th century. The assembled fellows of the Society of Antiquaries concluded that the body in the wall was probably that of William Lindwood, a courtier and sometime bishop of St David's, who died in the middle of the 15th century. Lindwood, the son of a prosperous Lincolnshire wool merchant, was among the ablest church lawyers of his generation. After study at Cambridge, he was showered with rich church livings, and he spent the rest of his life working as an administrator, a civil servant of sorts. He first served in the household of the Bishop of Salisbury, before joining the household of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and rising to become the Dean of the Court of Arches, the Chief Justice of the Church's Supreme Court in England. In that role, he was noticed by King Henry VI, who brought him into royal service. He served as a trusted diplomat, and in 1432 he was appointed as Lord Privy Seal, taking care of the King's personal seal, a very trusted position. In 1442, after the King petitioned the Pope, he was appointed Bishop of St David's and was consecrated in the Chapel Royal of St Stephen, in which the body in the wall was found. He was made Bishop of St David's, effectively to give him more income. He never visited his cathedral, never once set foot in Wales. He continued in royal court service until he died. Before his death, Lyndwood writes a very illuminating will. He left his body, and I quote, "to be buried in the chapel of St Stephen in Westminster, where I received the gift of consecration, in such place as may be agreed upon between the dean and canons of the said chapel and my executors." He also asked that his executors establish a chantry chapel. This was to be in Bassa Capella, the lower or basement chapel of St Stephen's, and the priest employed was to pray for the soul of the said late bishop, whose body rests interred in the said under chapel. It was in that very under chapel that the body in the wall was found in 1852. In the absence of evidence to the contrary, the body is very likely to be Lyndwood's. Dying as he did in the royal court, presumably his body was simply prepared for burial following the established routines and methods used for the bodies of royalty, which is why he was found wrapped and mummified, as though ready to lie in state like a king. Thanks so much for watching this video. I do hope you have enjoyed it. If you like what you see on this channel, please don't forget to click the little subscribe button at the bottom there. By the magic of YouTube, you'll be told when there is another edition of Antiquarians Anonymous. Thanks again for watching. Bye for now.